In this module, we're going to take a look at racial and ethnic minorities. First, let's talk about what race is versus what ethnicity is. So race is a category of people who are defined as similar because of a number of shared physical characteristics. Really think biology here. Most often these things have to do with skin color, hair, other biological genetic factors. Ethnicity, on the other hand, or an ethnic group, they really share a distinct cultural tradition. That's its own member's identity. So if you belong to a particular race, often that's tied to things that you weren't able to really control, they were ascribed, whereas ethnicity or ethnic group really talks to more of a cultural sense. Things like traditional food, customs, and beliefs, those types of things. So minority groups, though, are people who, because of either a physical or cultural characteristic, are often singled out from others in society for differential and unequal treatment. They also regard themselves as objects of discrimination in many cases. And minority groups can come in a number of factors. It could be that you are a minority group because you belong to a particular race, ethnic group. Maybe it's a particular occupational minority group that you belong to, a political minority group. There's a number of ways you think of it, but sociologically, when we talk about a minority group, we're really using this framework and this definition. It's because of physical and cultural characteristics where you're singled out. Think of maybe somebody who has an outward-facing disability. They're in a wheelchair. Maybe they use a cane. Those are forms of identification with potentially a minority group. So there's also prejudice and discrimination, which is where identification with a minority group is fine, but then when you have acts of prejudice and acts of discrimination, it starts to become problematic. Prejudice is an irrationally based negative or occasionally positive attitude, so it's a thought. It's not actually taking action, it's just a thought towards certain groups and their members. So again, it could be negative, but it might also be positive. You might prejudge someone because you have a positive perception. One of the most classic stereotypes is saying something to the effect of that an Asian student would be good at math. While that stereotype is positive in some nature, saying that they would be good, it's still a stereotype, and in fact it's still a prejudice. It's judging them without actually knowing anything about them other than the race they appear to be. So that's prejudice. Discrimination is when you actually take that and turn it into differential treatment, usually unequal, usually injurious, and it's accorded to individuals who are assumed to belong to a particular category. They may not even belong to that group. Maybe it's somebody that was believed to be gay, but wasn't actually gay. It doesn't matter if the people committing the act of discrimination believed that they were a member of that particular group. So one of the theorists that we talked about early in the course was Robert K. Merton. And Merton looked at this and said, it's not just that you have prejudice and it leads to discrimination, it's that there's a number of ways people kind of balance and interact between their prejudices and discrimination. So he came up with what he called this typology of looking at, does the person discriminate and is the person prejudiced? Because he believed that you could be prejudiced and you could discriminate, or you might not be prejudiced and you might not discriminate. So he said this, if a person is prejudiced and they discriminate, they are a prejudiced discriminator, and he called that an active bigot, meaning that they are actively seeking out to discriminate based on their prejudices. But Merton also said it's possible someone could be prejudiced but not act on that. Here he called this the prejudiced non-discriminator, someone who is a timid bigot, meaning they are not acting on what they believe inside. So they may have the feelings, but they don't actually act upon them or outwardly express them. Then he looked at the unprejudiced discriminator, and he called this an easily swayed individual. Now you think of this and you say, how can they have an unprejudiced discriminator? How would somebody be discriminating if they weren't actually prejudiced? Here's a great example, or a few ways to think of it. Think of it if you were the boss at work and you owned a small business and you had an all-white workforce, and you said that you wanted to hire maybe an African American or a Latin American to join the workforce, and you had no problem with it, but all of your workers told you they would quit and walk off the job. So even though you weren't prejudiced, let's say you didn't hire that person because your workers threatened you, you then still discriminated even though you personally didn't feel like there was an issue and you weren't yourself prejudiced. So often the circumstances can force people to act in that way. It's also sometimes if you don't feel a particular way but don't speak up and don't say anything about it, you're allowing or condoning that discrimination to go on even though you don't believe in the prejudice behind it. You're still allowing it. Finally, He really wanted you to seek out friends, or those that are accepting, and he called those the unprejudiced non-discriminators. They aren't prejudiced, and they do not discriminate. So this is kind of an interesting way to recognize that prejudice and discrimination does not just show up in one kind of flavor or fashion. It can interchange in a lot of ways. Finally, this also looks at the responses to conflict in regards to when you have races and ethnic groups coming together. So the one form is assimilation. That's coming together in what we often prescribe as the melting pot idea. All the different cultures, all of the different races coming together to be American. That's sometimes how it was looked at for many, many years. But we've kind of drifted away from that melting pot notion, especially in sociology, and now we talk about pluralism. Pluralism is more the coexistence of separate racial and ethnic groups within a society. If you look at like the Los Angeles basin, you know that there's Chinatown, Little Italy, Little Saigon, all those different ethnic enclaves that show up. That's more of an example of this pluralism, allowing all of it to coexist within a society and bring those elements of culture together, but keeping them a bit separate. And in sociology, we refer to that more as a salad, kind of thinking of all the parts work together to create this nice salad or society, but really they're very distinct, each holding on to what makes them themselves. Another much more negative kind of response to a conflict in race and ethnicity can be subjugation. That's subordination of one group with another group over them and dominating against them. Subjugation is definitely not good because it involves this power relationship in which a group is simply controlled and dominated. And a real extreme example of that then that moves into segregation. That's the physical act or process or state of being separated, to be set apart. Think of the US and think about when we actually had colored versus white and everything. Drinking fountains, bus sections, train sections. So segregation takes the subjugation to an actual physical setting apart and breaking apart. So these are some of the key core concepts of race and ethnic relations, as well as race and ethnic groups. Be sure to review the entire text for the full detail of this lecture.